Have you been aboard a submarine before? This is the forward torpedo room. This is the weapons end of the submarine. This is the whole reason the submarine exists, in order to hunt other submarines and to kill them when they're not the good guys.
How many torpedoes could it hold?
You know, about 20 torpedoes in this compartment. 6 in the tubes, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 18 additional torpedoes would be maximum that we could put in here. Now, we wouldn't normally carry that many unless we were going to war, but we would certainly carry several and a couple of different types of torpedoes as well, depending on the operations.
Serving on this, even for testing, I'm sure you've seen these go, the torpedoes. Not seen them, but hear them.
Yep.
Can you feel it all through the ship, or what's it like?
Yeah, you feel the shudder of it being launched. There's a couple of different ways of firing the torpedoes, and it just depends on what the situation is, the tactical situation. Most torpedoes, once the torpedo tube has been flooded and the outer door is open, then in the time to fire the torpedo, they let it swim out because it's quieter to do that. But if they needed to fire it quickly or in an emergency situation, then they would blast it out with high pressure air. And then once the torpedo's gone, the water has to be drained down, and we have a tank below here which takes the water, and then that water is again pumped to sea, and the trim is adjusted because we will have gotten rid of a 5,000-pound object in the bow. So there has to be adjustments to the trim.
How far, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say there's other things in this compartment we could talk about. But you have a question?
How far do they, like again, I don't know anything about submarines or torpedoes. How far can they go?
It depends on the type of torpedo. The wire-guided torpedoes that modern submarines use today, I understand they have a range of 20 miles or so. Back in the day of World War II, when they didn't have wire-guided torpedoes, they all had the old Mark 8 torpedoes, they could run for 8 to 10 miles before they strike their subject.
For these, and again, nothing. Are they not guided? But I mean, are they point and shoot, or can they follow a target? I guess.
No, well, what happens is that they're guided from inside the submarine, from the control room computers. They guide the torpedo to where the captain wants them to go, and then once they've acquired the target, when the sonar, the built-in sonar that's in the bow of these, once it's acquired the target, then the wire is cut, and the submarine or the torpedo is on its own to hunt the target.
How much in explosives?
I don't know. I have to do a little research on that, but I'm thinking 500 pounds of high explosive.
And while I got you here, just because it's perfect lighting, if you don't mind, how long did you serve on this?
I served on all 3 of our Canadian submarines from about 1966 through late 66 through to 1973, with a couple of interruptions for courses and other things, but for the most part, that's where my service.
What drew you to a submarine?
Well, that's easy. I went to see it first in a destroyer, and I found that I didn't have the sea legs that I needed. And when I had an opportunity to visit a submarine and submerge, and then suddenly realized that this is an environment that I could certainly easily live in. So I immediately transferred to submarine duty.
A couple of things that I would think of or fear. Claustrophobic?
Not me.
Is it though? Like, could you see that happening?
Oh yeah, everybody who volunteers for submarine service has to go through a battery of psychological tests and physical tests to see that they're not going to be bothered by such things as claustrophobia, and they have to have good personalities to intermix with the rest of the crew. You don't want somebody who has a bad temper or He doesn't have the patience to be a submariner, because a great deal of the time when you're submerged and you're in the ocean, it's very quiet, and you're required to be very patient and do your job. Then it's interrupted by absolutely rapid big things going on all at the same time, in which they called into action stations. Everybody closes up. But during the normal watch, people go to do their duties, and then there's cleaning. You have to keep the submarine very, very clean. The last thing you need on a submarine is somebody to get infected with some kind of a virus and pass it on to everybody else. So cleanliness is next to godliness in submarines, and so we're always cleaning, and they're always maintaining equipment. There's no point in being at sea if you can't use everything that's there. So, and we're all trained to operate all the equipment, and to be a qualified submariner, you have to know where everything is and what everything does and how it all operates, and find everything in the dark if necessary.
Ever have any close calls?
Not anything that I would write in my diary as being deadly. We've had a couple of incidents where we were close to things that were a bit threatening, but I never felt particularly threatened on living on board here. I trusted this submarine and the other two submarines that I served on implicitly, and the crew.
And tell me about, if you can, you were saying what class these are, things like that?
These are Oberon class submarines. They were built in the 60s by the British and in Chatham, England. And this is the original of the three. So it does not have a lot of Canadian modifications that were available for the next two submarines, the Onondaga and the Okanagan. But this submarine has undergone significant refit since we first acquired it, and upgraded many of the electronics and the sonar.
Coming to the end, so forgive me and thank you. You live close to here, I take it, obviously?
Me? I live in Brantford.
What was this like when you knew this was coming close to you? What were your feelings?
I was excited. I was delighted to hear that the submarine had been acquired by the Military Museum, and I knew that it was going to be a bit of a lengthy time before it arrived here, because it had to be refit in Heddle Marine and Hamilton. And I went down there on a couple of occasions to see what they were doing. And then I was here for almost the entire evolution of them bringing this thing ashore and putting it on the pad. It was a remarkable feat of engineering, and my hat's off to all of the people who were involved in bringing this submarine here.
Was it emotional?
For me, oh yeah, it brought a tear to my eye. You know, when I saw it, every time I come down here, I remember the days. Once you're a submariner, you're always a submariner, and so we have a very strong affinity. I conduct tours on this boat several times a year. Come down here when we don't have a COVID-19 problem, and take people through, and we spend, anywhere from an hour to 2 hours taking people through and answering their questions and pointing out all the things that we need to do to make this tour interesting.
Last question. What's if you know, what's the most common question people ask?
The most common question people ask, I think, is they probably want to know how long we go to sea, how many men served on board, and how deep does it go?
And?
Well, it goes to sea anywhere from 4 or 5 days to 65 or 70 days, and it could be submerged almost the entire time we're away, because we snorkel to charge the batteries, and it has a crew of about, on average, 65 men and officers, and we operate at a depth down to about 600 feet.
He's got more or less the best.
Yep. Yeah. So this is the control room, and this is where all the action happens. This is where the commander, the captain does his business, and this is where the officer of the watch is in control during the anytime we're at sea. If we're on the surface and we're transiting to some place, then the officer of the watch would be on the bridge, which is about 60 feet above our heads, and he would be up there with 2 lookouts while we're on the surface. But once we're submerged, those doors are shut, of course, and everybody works in the control room. We have the one-man control. This little compartment over here is where all the sonarmen worked, and we'd have 3 sonarmen on duty in there at any given point in time. Unfortunately, we don't have any of the equipment. All the equipment, because it was classified when the submarine was decommissioned, was taken off the boat, and we have never been able to get it back. This would be where the periscopes are. So we'd have a attack periscope here that would go up through here. But the periscope is sitting outside at the moment, and we hopefully one day we'll get that periscope either back in here or in some place where people can start to look through it. And this is the after the search periscope, which is a binocular periscope, and what it was functioning, his primary function was to act as lookout when we were snorkeling. When we're submerged and we need to recharge the batteries, we need to run the engines, and so in order to do that, we had to be close to the surface, close enough that we could stick a mast out of the water, and called an induction mast, and the air can come in and feed the engines with the air necessary for it to run. So when we were there, because we would be vulnerable to collision with surface ships, because the top of the fin would only be a few feet below the water. So we always had to have a lookout, and that was one of the responsibilities of the officer of the watch. And he went in there and he would circle around and keep an eye on the horizon and also into the air, so that to determine if there's any airplanes going on. We also would have electronic countermeasures mast raised as well, so that we'd be able to detect if there's any radar. If we were in particularly vulnerable waters, if we hear radar coming that is suspicious, then we would stop snorkeling and go deep, and come back up a little later on and go snorkeling. When we're at periscope depth, it's a major challenge, particularly in heavy weather, to maintain the proper depth so that that mast is always out of the water. Because what happens if a wave washes over it, there's a big collar on it that floats up and shuts the induction, and the next thing we know, this pressure inside the submarine is dropping dramatically, because the engines, of course, are consuming the air. So as soon as we get past that wave and that collar drops down again, the air rushes back in and equalizes the pressure, which is already significantly lower than the outside air pressure, because of course you need to have the ability to draw that air in. So those diesel engines consume a massive amounts of air, because they're big 16-cylinder diesels, and they're supercharged. This is the chart table. This is where the chief of the watch and the XO often work. They keep track of where we are at any given point in time. This is also where they would chart various contacts. From the sonar department, they would be listening to sounds in the water for 360 degrees around the boat, and every time they detect a surface ship or they have to classify to determine whether it's a tanker, what kind of a tanker it is, whether it's a an oil tanker or a freighter of some sort, and whether it has 1 shaft or 2 or 3 or 4 shafts, and how many blades are on that. Those are all part of the job of the sonarman to report all that. And of course, what we're primarily looking for are warships and submarines. I mean, this is an anti-submarine submarine. Its main purpose is to hunt and detect enemy submarines. And at that time, in the Cold War, of course, that was the Soviets. We needed to know where they were, so it was part of our responsibility to track those and go into areas where we could do that. But our other main responsibility was to train anti-submarine forces, NATO ships and aircraft and other submarines, and we were often the target of their anti-submarine activities. We would go someplace, an area south of Bermuda or maybe down in the Caribbean, or off the coast of Newfoundland, for example, and there would be a NATO task force, and our job would be to avoid detection. Of course, their job is to find us. And so it was sort of almost a simulated war situation, so that their training could be as positive as possible, so they could train their anti-submarine aircraft and their pilots and their sonar operators on the warships. And we, on the other hand, we're trying to keep out of the way and not make it difficult for them to find us, of course. And that was the sort of the major motivation of the exercise. Yeah. And because at that time and during the Cold War, everybody was involved in wanting to keep the Soviets at bay. And so that was the nature of the Cold War. This device over here is called the one-man control. We had where many submarines have one person on the stern planes and one person on the bow planes and one person operating the rudder. This guy here controls it like an aircraft. So this can go forward to drive the planes into dive position, or it can go back to pull the planes into a rise position. So, and he has here a bubble or a inclinometer. I can never say that. So he knows what the angle of the submarine is, and he has a compass here, and has his depth gauge here, and he has an autopilot as well that he can rely on. And so if you're spending weeks at sea, this could be a pretty boring job if you're just going to maintain depths. So we have an autopilot, and this is the panel that controls that sends signals to the electrical room, so that they can. So the captain can order the speed that he wants.
Do you, whether you're new to this or whether you've been on this for years, as a question for somebody that it's a first timer, does everybody hit their head?
Not everybody, but certainly me. I'm 6'2", so I had to learn to duck.
Did sometimes, no matter you've been here for years, does sometimes it still catch it?
I still hit my head on these little high pressure air valves and other places on the boat that I forget are there, because it's been many years since I've spent time at sea on these boats. So I still hit my head from time to time, but I'm very careful. I don't move quickly. So the last thing I want to do is split my head open on some protrusion or other. And I do have memory, it comes back to me. So, yeah.
Can I ask your age?
I'm 70. I'll be 75 in January. So
when's the last, if you know, and as I say, I don't want to, not mathematician, but when's the last time you were on this serving then? Like, do you know roughly how many years ago?
Yeah, it would be. Let me think. It'd be almost 50 years ago. Yep. It would be 47 years ago was the last time I was. Now, just to give you an example, what we face when things get we're dark. So this is the kind of room we lived in for a good deal of the time that we were submerged. And the reason for it is because if in the event we had an incident and we had to surface in a hurry, then everybody's eyes would be adjusted to the dark before we got there. And when we're snorkeling, of course, the guy on the after periscope needs to be able to see as well. So we dim the lights even further when we're snorkeling so that his eyes are completely adjusted to the dark to look through the periscope and see things without... and we learn to operate in low, very low red lighting. So we often would have the red lighting down at this kind of level so that we can, and we get used to working in this kind of lighting. The ministry makes sure that submariners get the best quality food. So we get the best meats and the best vegetables and fruit, fresh fruit, and we store a lot of it on board, and we have freezers and refrigerators and storage cupboards, and the cooks do their principal responsibility is to feed the crew and make sure that we're happy, because a hungry crew is not a happy crew. And they have to be cognitive of their environment, because if we're on the surface, for example, the seas could be quite rough and their boat would roll and pitch, and so they would have to adjust their menu accordingly so they don't have things that are being splashed around in that kind of weather. Or if we're submerged and the captain decides to put on a 30-degree bow down angle, they have to be cognizant of that too. We have a deep fat fryer, and I have a closet at home which is bigger than this room. And in here they work, and they work with each other, and they prepare all these wonderful meals for us. You pick up your meal and carry it forward. So often, you're taking your meal from here to the accommodation space through a dark red control room. You might find when you get to your mess that a handful of your French fries disappeared somehow. And all the auxiliary, much of the auxiliary equipment is located below here. So this is the engine room. There are two engines here. Each engine has 16 cylinders, and a diesel engine, they run at around 950 RPM when they're charging. And their sole function is to turn a generator, and the generators charge the battery. So we have a battery on board the submarine. There's actually two batteries, and each battery has 240 cells. So 224 cells, pardon me. So we have 448 cells altogether. And each cell is about 20 inches by 20 inches square and about 5 feet tall. And they're lead acid batteries like you'd find in your car, only much, much bigger. And those batteries provide all the electricity that the submarine requires for its propulsion, for its operation of all of the equipment. And there's auxiliary generators that run from the battery for 3-phase power and single-phase power and direct current power that the submarine requires in its normal operations. And it becomes very noisy in here, but the noise is isolated from the hull with very large dampening equipment so that the vibrations from the engine do not get sent out into the ocean. And so that's one of the requirements of these. Are very well engineered diesels for that purpose, and they're supercharged diesels, so they consume a great deal of air when they're operating. So what they can do is that if the captain wants to go very fast, if he needs to get the hell out of Dodge in a hurry, he can put the batteries in series and crank the revolutions as fast as possible, and we can get this submarine going at 17, 18 knots submerged. And in an hour and a half or so, we can be 30 miles away from wherever the action is. The main escape is in the 42. We didn't talk about it.